All right, we'll get started in just a moment here. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar series. This is the first in a series of 3 webinars hosted by scientists at USGS about the National Water Availability Assessment. Before I hand things off to our speakers today, I'm going to give a brief overview of Quasi while folks are logging on and getting settled. My name is Julia Masterman. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator for Quasi. Quasi is a consortium of universities for the advancement of hydrologic science. We're a nonprofit organization funded in part by the National Science Foundation, and our mission is to empower the water community and advance science through collaboration, infrastructure, and education. We sustain infrastructure to enable research and collaboration by hosting data repositories for water science data, including HydroShare. By providing this type of support and infrastructure, Quasi can help researchers formulate and execute their data management plans, be effective data stewards, and meet the requirements of funding agencies. We also provide educational opportunities and infrastructure for student support. These include workshops, a summer institute for graduate students, webinar series, and events like this one, a virtual university, and more. Both our data infrastructure and educational opportunities are designed to enable collaboration and interdisciplinary work. There are a few upcoming deadlines I want to highlight. Firstly, the deadline to apply to the Snow Measurement Field School is tomorrow. If you're interested in gaining fundamental training on snow measurement in the field, I'd encourage you to apply. This year, it will be hosted in Granby, Colorado. We have another webinar series going on this fall with the AGU Hydrology Section Student Subcommittee, focusing on professional development skills and advice as students and early career professionals navigate academic waters. Our next webinar will be on October 8th, and previous webinars in this series can also be found on the Quasi YouTube channel. I'd encourage you to connect with us, join our mailing list. I'll put a number of links in the chat in a moment, or reach out. So as I mentioned, this is the first webinar in a 3-part series. We hope you'll join us for the remainder of webinars in this series. A quick note that daylight savings time will impact the timing of the 3rd webinar, so depending on where you find yourself, you may want to take that into account. All right. Today's webinar is on understanding the science behind the National Water Availability Assessment. Before we get started, a few logistics. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Quasi YouTube channel. Secondly, we ask that you use the Q&A functionality to submit questions to the presenters. Please feel free to add questions at any time and upvote any that are especially of interest. The panelists will try to get to as many as we can. Finally, we expect that all involved with Quasi Cyber seminars uphold the code of conduct and promote and maintain a professional, considerate, respectful, and collaborative virtual environment. So thank you for being a part of that. All right, thank you so much to our speakers for joining us today. We're really excited to learn from you both. And with that, I will hand it off to you both. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Julia. There's our slides. So thanks, Julia, and thanks all of you for attending. Like Julia said, this is the first of our 3-part webinar series about the USGS National Water Availability Assessment. I'm Meg Shoda. I'm joined by Ted Stets. I'm a hydrologist in the USGS water mission area, and Ted's a research ecologist in the mission area as well. So let's walk through our plan for today's presentation. First, I'm going to answer the question, what is the National Water Availability Assessment? And I'll provide some background about the assessment. And then Ted's going to spend the bulk of today's presentation talking about some of the key findings of the assessment. So that'll include findings related to water supply, water quality, water use. Ted will present a summary of the drivers of the different components and how they're expected to change in the future. And then lastly, Ted's going to explain what integrated water availability means. So like, what are some of our key findings when we integrate different components of water availability, like water quality and water supply. And then to wrap up today's talk, we'll come back to me. I'll mention what the team is working on next. And then we're planning on about 20 minutes for question and answer at the end of our talk. So just get into some quick intro here. The USGS developed the National Integrated Water Availability Assessment, which is, like the slide says, is comprehensive scientific assessment of water availability in the US that aims to integrate quantity, quality, and use. It provides new water availability information, including a potential imbalance between water supply and demand. So the assessment estimates supply and demand and reports on how and why supply and demand have changed over time. One of the goals of the assessment is to identify challenges that the nation may have in meeting its demand for water, either due to lack of water quantity, high water demand, or poor water quality. And we are delivering the water availability assessment in 3 ways. The first is this interpretive part of the assessment, which is a USGS report with chapters on each of the water availability components. So there's a chapter on water supply, there's a chapter on water quality, and that's what we're going to focus on in today's presentation. The modeled water data that are underlying the interpretation are available in the National Water Availability Assessment Data Companion. And the interactive report summary is a really accessible way to understand the key findings with interactive visualizations. So today we're going to focus on the interpretation. We're going to answer questions like, do we have enough water? How does water quality impact water availability? And today's webinar is going to provide some big picture background about national scale water availability and walk through some of the key findings of the assessment report. And then if you're interested in what you've seen today, like Julia said, the webinar on October 22nd is going to present how you can access the underlying modeled water data in the data companion. So if you're like, oh, I saw Ted talk about water use, but I'm really interested in water use by thermal electric power plants in the Midwest or something like that, on October 22nd, some of our developers are going to like hold your hand on how you can access those data. And then the webinar on November 19th is going to focus on data science, the workflows, and kind of the reproducible workflows that are used to create the data visualizations in the interactive report summary. And I'm going to drop a link in the Q&A for our website. You'll see that again at the end of the presentation, but you're welcome to explore like these resources on your own in the meantime. But we encourage you to attend the October and November webinars because we'll do a little deep dive on that stuff. Okay, so with that, I will hand it over to Ted, and he's going to kick off discussion of the key findings of the assessment.
Thanks for that introduction, Meg. Now, as Meg said, we'll go over some of the key findings from the report itself. So the national assessment focuses on a wide range of aspects of water availability. The most basic list of these is called the core components of water availability. And they're divided into 4 sectors: water supply, water quality, water use, and then aquatic community health. And we'll go through some of the high-level findings from each of these sectors and then look at some of the ways we combine them to create a more integrated look at water availability. First, we'll look at water supply. And when we talk about water supply in the context of the national assessment, what we mean is the quantity of water that's supplied to the nation through climatic inputs. The models we used are resolved to the HUC-12 scale. That's a 12-digit hydrologic unit code. There are about 93,000 HUC-12s in the conterminous US, and they range in size from about 50 to 100 square kilometers. The output can also be aggregated to larger scales. And in this case, we're looking at the entire conterminous US and the water budget for it. On average, on an annual basis, about 5,000 billion gallons per day enters the conterminous US through precipitation. About 63% of that is returned to the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. About 25% results in stream flow to the coastal oceans. About 2% is lost as consumptive water use, which we'll talk about later. And about 10% is stored in surface or groundwater. We also looked at more closely at the hydrologic fluxes on the HUC-12 and the hydrologic region scale. Here we're looking at a summary of the average monthly precipitation, evapotranspiration, and stream flow that occurs within each hydrologic region. Precipitation is shown as a positive value on each of the panels, and evaporation and stream flow are shown as negative values. The red line expresses the monthly accumulation of storage, and all of the values are shown in millimeters per month. And as you can see, we have these broken out by hydrologic region. There are 18 of those in the conterminous US, and we'll be referring to that spatial scale later in the talk as well. A few things to notice about this figure. So first of all, the absolute magnitudes differ greatly between regions with more precipitation and less precipitation. Drier regions have smaller magnitudes of all three of these. Second, some of the regions show a repeatable, strong seasonality in their hydrologic fluxes. This occurs in places like the Pacific Northwest, the Midwest, and Florida. Other regions have weaker seasonality, and the hydrologic fluxes are more controlled by interannual variability to a greater extent. And these include places like the Atlantic coast, Texas, and the Mississippi embayment. We looked at average storage at the Huck 12 scale in soil moisture, maximum snow water equivalent, and lake and reservoir storage. Our analyses looked into the CONUS scale responses in soil moisture to prolonged drought periods, as well as the relative contribution of snow accumulation to water supply in different regions. We also analyzed the size and volume distributions of lakes and reservoirs within the different hydrologic regions themselves. Some areas of the United States obtain a substantial amount of the water needed for human activities from groundwater, which may lead to declines in groundwater levels if recharge of groundwater aquifers is insufficient. For example, the groundwater levels were determined to be low in comparison with historical averages in several important aquifer systems that supply water resources to many people across the nation. These include the California Coastal Basin aquifers, the Colorado Plateau aquifers, Snake River Plain basaltic rock aquifers, the Rio Grande aquifer system, and the North Atlantic Coastal Plain aquifer system. Additionally, the central and southern regions of the High Plains unconfined aquifer showed declines during water years 2010 to 2020, which are part of a long history of groundwater depletion in that region. The data used to create this figure came from the National Groundwater Monitoring Network. And at the time of analysis, there were a few notable gaps in coverage of well observations. Probably the most notable of these was in the Central Valley aquifer in California. However, that data gap has recently been filled, and we will be able to include it in the version 1B report, which is focused on trends. The updated data set was compiled and published by Michaela Cherry from the Nebraska Water Science Center as part of the Water Mission Area Trends and Drivers project. The model outputs used in this assessment were largely created on other teams in the USGS, and the National Assessment Team used this information to provide a synthesis of water supply. And you can see on this slide a listing of some of the publications associated with the National Assessment that we used in order to draw the conclusions in the assessment itself. Next, we'll look at water quality in the nation. Our analysis for this study was mostly based on a literature review of previous national and aggregated regional water quality assessments in surface water and groundwater. Threats to water quality differ depending on what it's being used for. For example, drinking water quality requirements are different than those for crop irrigation. We analyzed some of these differences and how they differentially affect water availability throughout the nation. The figure shown on this slide was adapted from a publication by Ken Belitz and others in 2022, and it shows the principal aquifers that provide about 1/3 of the water used for public supply in the US. The pie chart associated with each aquifer shows the percentage of that study area that has high, moderate, or low levels of constituents in untreated groundwater. The contaminants of concern in this figure are primarily inorganic contaminants, such as arsenic, manganese, radionuclides, and nitrates. The figure shown on this slide is similar to the previous one, except that it breaks out the contaminants into those from geologic sources versus human sources. And it shows that in many of the principal aquifers, geologically sourced contaminants were a significant concern. Geologically sourced contaminants would include things like arsenic, which can be very detrimental to human health and when it's found in drinking water. Looking across a list of contaminants in groundwater, we can see that the highest numbers of people are affected by arsenic, manganese, and other geologically derived contaminants in groundwater. Where possible, the concentration of water quality constituents was compared with human or ecological benchmarks in order to place the findings in the context of their relationship to the potential for water availability limitation. As an example, the figure on this slide is showing the results of regional sparrow model applications that were combined to provide a picture of total nitrogen and total phosphorus concentrations across the conterminous US. The color scale is showing the model concentration in relation to the EPA National Rivers and Stream Assessment regional water quality criteria for the near reference conditions. Areas shown as dark green were found to have concentrations near reference conditions, and so they're the most pristine. And the color ramp shows multiples of the regional concentrations, with the highest category, the ones that are in dark pink, showing more than 10 times higher than the near reference benchmark for ecological health. We approached water quality in relation to benchmark standards in other ways as well. One important piece of information that we get from the sparrow models is the total load and sources of nitrogen and phosphorus to surface waters. On this slide, we're looking at a summary of nitrogen loads and sources summarized by hydrologic region. A few important patterns stand out. The nitrogen loads to the Midwest and Tennessee, Missouri regions are very high. In these regions, fertilizer and manure account for a large percentage of the total nitrogen loads. In other densely populated regions, nitrogen from wastewater is more important. This includes places like Texas, the northeastern United States, and the California and Nevada regions. Some of the key sources used in this presentation are listed on this slide, and many more studies were cited in the assessment report as well. Next, we'll look at water use. This is a crucial part of the overall water availability picture. The USGS has provided estimates of water use for decades. Those estimates have always been based on aggregates of state-level data, but in the past few years, the USGS has developed modeling approaches to provide estimates of water use with higher spatial and temporal resolution. At the time that this report was written, models existed for crop irrigation, thermoelectric power generation, and public supply. These three categories account for about 90% of the withdrawals nationally. The water use modeling team, which is different than the national assessment team, is currently developing estimates for 5 other categories of water use as well. These include self-supplied domestic, livestock, mining, industrial, and aquaculture. However, those models were not available for the version of the assessment report that we're discussing here. This map is showing the average total water withdrawals for the conterminous US as a sum of the 3 major categories for this report. This map is displaying the results on a Huck 12 scale, but the native model resolution is actually quite a bit finer than that. The crop irrigation model is produced at the scale of farm fields. The public supply model is produced at the scale of the public supply surface area boundaries, and the thermoelectric withdrawal model is produced at the scale of individual thermoelectric power plants. The water use modeling team has published a number of journal articles and data releases with more details on these models. The analysis for the national assessment built upon this work. On average, during the water years 2010 to 2020, about 225,000 million gallons per day of fresh water were used for combined uses of crop irrigation, public supply, and thermoelectric power in the lower 48 states. And about 21,000 million gallons per day of saline water was also used for thermoelectric power. These are mostly coastal places that use coastal water for cooling thermoelectric power plants. One unique aspect of the modeling approach to water use is that it allows greater temporal resolution in our analysis of water withdrawals. For example, we can see that water use peaked in 2012 during a prolonged dry period. This is the result of greater crop irrigation withdrawals during that period. Other findings in this assessment and from the water use modeling team include that thermoelectric withdrawals are decreasing throughout the modeling period, and also that per capita use for public supplies is decreasing, although this is approximately offset by growth in population, so that the overall public supply water use has remained relatively stable. So even though we're getting more efficient with our public supply water use, its use is remaining relatively stable due to population growth. We also analyzed how the relative use of surface water and groundwater varied across the nation. Regionally, crop irrigation was the primary water use category in the Western and High Plains aggregated hydrologic regions of the US, whereas water use for thermoelectric power was the largest water use category in the Northeast and Midwest and Southeast aggregated hydrologic regions. Groundwater was a larger proportion of public supply withdrawals than surface water in the Western part of the US, and the opposite was true in the Northeast through Midwest and Southeast regions, where surface water was a larger proportion of the public supply withdrawals. Groundwater was an important source of water for crop irrigation across the conterminous US, although it was the predominant source in the Southeast and Midwest aggregated regions. In the Western aggregated region, surface water was also an important source of water for crop irrigation. On the other hand, thermoelectric power used primarily surface water sources in all of the hydrologic regions of the US. The water use modeling team has published a number of journal articles and data releases with more details on these models. The analysis for the national assessment was built upon that work. We also discussed the impact of the changing climate on water availability. We focus on drivers such as heat, rising sea level, and precipitation. And the following slide shows two things. First, the confidence in the change of the projected driver, and second, examples of water cycle or water availability responses to these drivers. Darker shaded areas indicate higher confidence, and the color shading on the maps broadly indicates the degree of confidence in the projections of change in the driver from larger regions in the IPCC 6th assessment report. The regions shown on the map are the National Climate Assessment regions, while the shadings are from the IPCC and other sources. The first two processes shown on the slide are wetting conditions and snow and ice. The icons are located near the area believed to be most impacted. Some examples of the effects on water availability are a contraction in the areas experiencing seasonal freezing and an increase in precipitation intensity in some areas. The next two processes are coastal processes as well as temperature and drought. Some example effects include increased fire weather associated with prolonged drought and greater impacts to coastal areas in terms of salinization and flooding. This is a very broad brush overview level illustration of concerns for water availability in the future. Each of the processes is referenced in the chapter and supported by published references. There are current research efforts within the USGS on many of these processes. Finally, we put various pieces from water supply, water use, and water quality together to create a more integrated assessment. On this slide, we're looking at the average water supply defined as average stream flow for each of the hydrologic regions. We compare that against the average consumptive use, and the regions are sorted by decreasing supply. There's a much greater range in supply than consumptive use across the regions. Therefore, in the wettest regions, supply is much higher than demand, and the likelihood of water limitation is lower. In the drier regions, supply and consumptive use are closer in magnitude, and the chances of water limitation are greater. It's important to note that this is showing long-term average across large areas. Within all of these regions, there are certain times and certain places where water limitation is more likely. But this analysis helps to give some perspective on where the water limitations are more likely to occur. We also express the tendency for water limitation using something we call the supply and use index. The red and orange areas are places where the supply and use index is higher. Higher values of the supply and use index indicate a greater likelihood of local water limitation. Nearly 30 million people lived in areas where water use was a high percentage of the surface water supply, which indicates a high likelihood of local water limitation. The supply and use index is also temporally dynamic, with some areas experiencing a greater potential for water limitation on an intermittent basis. This figure is showing the percentage of the conterminous US in various categories of supply and use index for every month in the analysis from 2010 to 2020. Across the conterminous US, the areas subject to elevated supply and use index was greatest during a prolonged dry period in 2012 and 2013. During this period, water supplies were lower and water consumption, especially for crop irrigation, was larger. It's important to recognize that the supply and use index is only one way of looking at water limitation. There are many other ways in which water can become limited. We also integrated several other ways of looking at water limitation into the assessment. We considered water quantity through the supply and use index, which we just discussed. Surface water quality was considered using the results of the Sparrow model for nitrogen and phosphorus that we looked at a little bit earlier. Groundwater quality was considered using a Conus scale model for arsenic and nitrate in groundwater. And finally, we also considered alterations to ecological flows. That analysis looked at how alterations in stream flow conditions are potentially detrimental to local aquatic ecological communities. It's different from the supply and use index because it doesn't just consider total volume changes, but also changes to flow timing, magnitude, low flows, and flooding, et cetera. So when we look at the relative stress of each individual water availability component within each hydrologic region, we gain a better picture of the overall water availability limitation. Blue areas indicate low stress, and high stress is indicated by red and orange colors on these maps. Finally, we put it all together with this figure, which shows the assessment of stress on water availability in the 4 categories: supply and demand imbalance, the surface water supply and use index, which we just discussed, surface water quality for model estimates of total nitrogen and total phosphorus, groundwater quality for models of nitrate and arsenic, and the percentage of river miles in each region with ecological flow alterations. A few main takeaways from this analysis are, first, that the central and southern high plains and the Texas regions all had the highest stress levels in multiple categories. The California-Nevada region had high stress levels in all categories. All of the regions had moderate stress or higher in at least one category. And generally speaking, regions that had high stress in one category tended to have high stress in another category as well. And this suggests that the stresses and water limitation co-occur in regions. In other words, places that have greater water limitation from supply and use index also have a greater tendency for water quality problems or problems with ecological flow characteristics. The United States is facing unprecedented challenges to water availability, and the USGS is providing novel, timely results to help inform decision makers across the country. In various parts of the nation, we have seen that water availability is potentially limited by low supply, high demand, or poor quality. For example, about 27 million people were found to live in areas where water use was a high percentage of water supply, which indicates a high degree of water stress. Also, groundwater aquifers that provide about 1/3 of public drinking water supplies were found to have elevated concentrations of contaminants such as arsenic, manganese, radionuclides, and nitrate. There are also impacts to aquatic ecosystems. For example, 3 fish species of conservation concern were found to have water availability limitations in large percentages of their habitat range. Findings like these are critical to help the nation manage its water resources effectively.
Okay, thanks, Ted. So that was a really fast kind of snapshot of some of our key findings of the report. But I'm just going to talk for a second about what the team is up to next. So this report that we've just discussed is the first in a series. Ted, can you go to the next slide? Or maybe it's lagged for me. There we go. So this focuses on this report we just talked about is what we call version 1A. It focuses on current status of the nation's water. Next year, we'll be releasing a report focused on historical trends and regional perspectives. So we kind of have this snapshot of where are we now, then we're gonna look backwards and say, where have we come from? How are things changing over long time periods? And then following that in 2030, we're gonna produce the first full assessment, which will include an update of current conditions, the historical trends, and future projections of water availability. Then after that, the assessments are planned on a 5-year cycle where we publish reports in 35 and 40 that include current status, past conditions, and future projections. So Ted had citations throughout the presentation, but the results that we featured here today really represent the work of a large writing and analysis team, and so we want to make sure that we credit them. The work presented today was developed by all the people listed on this slide, as well as a number of other teams that aren't listed here. You know, we're taking the first concrete steps towards this integrated national assessment, and it requires a lot of teams coming together, a lot of work of different teams. So I've seen some questions coming in through the Q&A. Thank you so much for your attention. If there are questions, go ahead and put them, add more questions to the Q&A right now. So I showed that Venn diagram in my slides. There's like the report, the data companion, and the interactive report summary. Those are all available right now for you to explore. You can access them through our webpage, which is right there. And any, like if we don't have time for questions or any detailed questions, or if you get in those resources and you want to follow up with us, please use that nationaliwas@usgs.gov email address. And that's the best way to follow up with us. Okay, Julia, I'll stop talking. Do you?
No, perfect. Thanks so much. All right, we can get right into the Q&A. The first question is coming from Jennifer, who asks, are pending updates to water use models including data centers within the industrial use category?
Yeah, there's lots of updates coming to the water use models. So in the talk, I breezed over this a bit, but there are 5 additional models. So the USGS has traditionally reported water use in 8 different categories, and 3 of those were available for this particular assessment. And the other 5 are being worked on right now. They should be published, I think, later this year. And in addition to that, the team will continue working on the models themselves and working on improvements in the models into the future.
Perfect, thanks. All right, water use correlates with nitrogen patterns. Are these both model estimates? Are there any uncertainty, or is there any uncertainty that's associated?
Yeah, the uncertainty, we didn't talk about that as much in the assessment, but the uncertainty comes out of the individual modeling products themselves, which have been published by other teams. And so we're citing that stuff in the assessment report. I don't know if that first part, water use correlates with nitrogen patterns. I don't know if that was a surprise, and that's why there's a question mark there. I think that is probably driven by agriculture more than anything else. Crop irrigation is such a heavy user of water throughout the U.S., and it probably is not a surprise that those areas also have higher nitrogen as well.
Yep. This also somewhat relates to the next question, which is water use for crop irrigation from surface water and groundwater are almost leveled, question mark. Might this be due to some adopted policy like conjunctive use?
I don't know about that. I don't think, my take on this is that it's really a climate variability signal more than anything else. The early part of our record of analysis for this particular study was a particularly dry period. So that included this kind of nationwide, or a large part of the nation was experiencing unusually dry conditions in 2012 and 2013. And so there was, I would say, not artificially, but a response to that was additional crop irrigation early in the record. And that seemed to ease a bit by the end of the record. And so I think it looks like a plateau when actually what's happening is that there is interannual variability that's a product of climate variability. And I think this speaks to the power of the models over the 5-year assessments that we used to do at the USGS. And so the team that's developing those models really deserves a lot of credit for adding that kind of insight into the variability in water use from year to year.
Thanks. Okay, zooming out a little bit, what was the main driver to produce this assessment? Future assessments in the 5-year timeframe. Was this driven by Congress or just USGS?
Yeah, I guess I don't think we talked about it all that specifically. There's something called the Secure Water Act, which was passed in, I think, 2009. And the USGS, along with a few other agencies, are developing national assessments of water in one way or another. So ours is the National Integrated Water Availability Assessment. The Department of Energy produces a regular report on the future of hydroelectric power based on future climate change. And the Bureau of Reclamation does one on Western water, and that is mostly focused on drought and climate change. That feels like a planted question. I don't know if somebody planted that or not. But...
It did come in as anonymous, so we'll never know.
That's suspicious.
All right, another anonymous question. The data companion seems to only contain water use data. When can we expect a fuller release of the other sectors or categories that are discussed?
This would be a perfect time for Shirley to answer that question.
Hello, I will answer. I can also type out the answer after I answer verbally as well, just so you guys have that record. But in October, we are going to be releasing 2 more sectors of information. So we'll be releasing integrated water availability and water quantity. And for the water quantity, it'll be an ensemble model output that we'll be releasing, and as well as a atmospheric forcings model data set. And then for the integrated water availability, we'll be releasing some of those integrated, like the surface water supply and use index kind of variables. So look for that in the next month.
Thanks.
Yeah, can I add a plug to that, Julia? If folks here wanna, I'll reply to that question with like a listserv that we use to communicate about this sort of thing, like new data releases and updates. And so if people want to join that, then you'll get an email directly when new data are available, and it's the best way to kind of keep in touch with us for updates, like we were showing here on the big timeline, but things that come out in between, every 5 years. I'll drop that in as the answer to the question.
Yeah, thanks. Also, I guess for the sake of the recording, another question was answered. Megan, you responded to a question in the Q&A. Are the slides available? And do you have a bibliography of relevant publications which provide the technical details of your models and analysis? This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Quasi YouTube channel. But Megan, do you want to speak more to the second part of the question?
Sure. I mean, Ted presented like a huge amount of information that is really the synthesis of a lot of like underlying things. So the best place to learn about like the details, like, oh, you showed that model for national scale total nitrogen, but I mean, this is a wonderful technical audience. I'm sure people have a lot of like follow-up technical questions. So the best place to find the answers for that is in the report itself, which contains these chapters and is very long. We recommend checking out chapter A. That's like kind of acts as like an executive summary, like that's a shorter loan, like what are the highlights from each of the chapters, and then all of the, of course, references and citations are in these reports. And again, if you are not finding what you're looking for, you can email us at this address on the slide, and we'd be happy to chat more.
Great, thanks. All right. Switching back here from Anne. When will the model estimates be completed for mining and industrial demand water?
That is a good question. I think the teams, those are not on the national assessment team. They're on the water use modeling team. And I believe they are scheduled to have that stuff done by the end of this calendar year. But I wouldn't swear to it. And I think their plan is to describe the methodologies in all of the 5 new updated categories in a single publication, and then release, have data releases. So make the data available, the output of the models and the model code published in the same time frame. So probably by the end of the calendar year, but I wouldn't swear to it. But if you are connected to that community, the water use community, keep your eyes open. I think that stuff will be coming. If you're not and would like to be, you can reach out and we'll connect you to the right people so you can keep an eye on that as well.
Thanks. All right. From Shahab, does the report include any assessment of climate change impacts, and how have different models been adjusted to account for these effects?
The climate impacts that we discussed in the chapter are all based on literature review. So it's all things that have already been published. We did not do any novel assessments of the impacts of climate change. The plan is now to include those in our version 2 assessment report, which is scheduled to come out in 2030. But for now, it was all literature based. And so everything is based on things that have already been published, mostly by other people.
Thanks. This may be related, from Mohammed. Is USGS just using its previous models for assessments? What about the real data from utilities and users? How is that data, if used, being validated?
I assume this is mostly from a question about the water use modeling. And I would say that
yeah, if not, yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So the most direct comparison comes from the thermoelectric data itself, which is an aggregation of power generation at different thermoelectric power plants. And there are conversions to water withdrawals based on the type of facility it is and how much power it's generating. So the team did that on a plant by plant basis. And so that's the most direct link, I would say. The other models were developed, the public supply model was developed as an artificial learning model, and there are some data sets that they can train that on, but it is not as widespread as you might like it to be overall. And then the last one is the crop irrigation, which was mostly based on ET and estimates of satellite-based observations of ET throughout the country, and comparing those to the potential evapotranspiration at different parts of the country. And so they are applied directly to fields that are known to be irrigated. And that's how the water use estimate is developed. And so the comparisons are not great in that one either, just in terms of the data sets available, because there just aren't a lot of direct observations of this sort of thing. And so a paper was just published in the Journal of Hydrology, which talks about this a lot more. I want to say Jonathan Haynes, or no, I think I'll drop it in the chat here or in the Q&A in just a moment. There was an author from the USGS was first author on that, and it just came out within the last month, Journal of Hydrology, and talks about that to a much greater degree.
Thanks. Okay, from Veronica, a longer question. Water availability is a growing challenge with the interplay of droughts, which are climate related, in the Mid-Atlantic area, there's a vast increase in development, also seen with the increase in data centers and other textile, noted to use more water than textile industries. What is the vision for drinking water, say in the Potomac River watershed basin, with all these growing challenges, especially those related to man-made pollutants like salt, PFAS, and how is that reflected in the assessment?
Sorry, I'm just reading
Yeah.
the question here. So I think the crux of the question is, what is the vision for drinking water, say in the Potomac watershed basin, with all these growing challenges, especially those related to man-made pollutants like salts and PFAS in the assessment? Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. We tried to look at the environmental contaminants in the environment itself, so not in the finished water necessarily in these different places. And so these are source waters, and we're looking at the presence of contaminants and whether they are nearing or above human health levels. The version 1B report talks more about trends and all of that stuff, and would be better for sort of prognostication in this way. But the assessment report that came out last January, the one we discussed today, was really about the status. So it just looks at it gives you a snapshot essentially, or a 10-year snapshot of the condition in different parts of the country. And so it's difficult to do much prognosticating on that, but the trend report should have better information on that.
Thanks. Thank you to the attendees for continuing to add questions. Just to note, you can also upvote if there are any questions that have been asked that we should prioritize. Thank you for all the questions that are coming in. And we can keep moving through these. And feel free to keep them coming. All right. From Youngjin, the analysis is focused on the 2010 through 2020 time period, which appears to be rather short for trend and impact studies. Are you going to analyze the model data and observations for a longer period? For example, water year 1980 to water year 2024?
Yes, simple answer is yes. And that will be coming out as part of the version 1B report. Some of the models have estimates going back to 1980. Other ones, we only really have the information going back to the early 2000s. And so in that case, it'll be a relatively short trend analysis, as you're noting, something more on the order of 20 years. But where available, we do go back 40 years and look at a longer trend period.
Thanks. Okay. From Chris, great presentation, Ted, especially with respect to working towards the integrated assessment. One nitpick, 10% of water entering storage strikes me as excessive, even allowing for interannual variations. Could this be related to an incomplete spin-up of some model?
Yes. I don't know. That strikes me as an error term more than anything else, but you know, there's probably a few percent going into storage, but yeah, 10% seems excessive to me as well.
Okay. Would you mind explaining ecological alteration and how you calculate that?
Yeah, so the best source for this is a publication by Darren Carlisle that came out in 2019. And we used that model assessment that he did directly for this report. Long story short is that Darren looked at places where ecological samples were collected as part of the EPA NERSA, and he may have used other data sources as well, but for sure the EPA NERSA was used, and related those to altered flow conditions at those locations, and was able to develop a set of metrics that were related to ecological degradation, and then reprojected all of those metrics onto NHD flow reaches in the US, and that's where that information comes from. But I recommend you go back and look at that publication by Darren Carlisle in 2019 for the details.
Thanks. Okay. What kind of modeling is planned for projections?
The plan, as I understand it right now, is that the forcing data that we used for these models is called CONUS 404, and it is a 40-year, 4-kilometer resolution model that generates 15-minute data. And the idea is to rerun CONUS 404 under a projected climate scenario, which is basically equivalent to the SSP3, which I think is the 7.0 Celsius in a century increase in temperature. And so essentially there's going to be a replay of the meteorologic conditions over the past 40 years as if they were starting in 2020 and rolling forward to 2060 under a climate change scenario. And that will be the basis for the projections that come out in 2030. That's the plan right now.
Thanks. Perhaps somewhat related, are you publishing the forcing inputs as well as analysis data model outputs too? For what temporal and spatial resolution and coverage?
All of it's published. It's all available. I recommend you take a look. If you're interested, you can reach out to me if you want. You can also look at the report and dig out what you're looking for there. But yes, all of it is available as data releases and often model releases as well by the USGS.
Thanks. Okay, another data availability question. Other than in the report PDF, where can I download the high-res image for the daily average water availability index map by HUC 12?
Do you know, Meg?
Yeah, so Shirley can probably chime in on this too, but those data are part of our October data release. You know, like, am I getting this right, Shirley? Yeah. So I'll put the link to the data companion in there, so it's not available like immediately, but if you go ahead, Shirley, I'll stop.
No, that's perfect, Meg. Yeah, so in October, once this the next data release that we're going to have in the data companion comes out, you'll be able to go to our website and find that exact map and download it and use it either as PDF or PNG. And you can already see the maps for all of the variables that are available now on the website. So if you go to the website and then go to the data catalog page, you'll see a little map icon for every single variable. You click that map icon and you'll be able to see the map for every variable. And yeah, when we have our next set of data sets coming out in October, you'll get a little map for every single one of those variables as well.
And those data will be live at the time of the October 22nd webinar in this series. People are always interested in the data, so we thought we were talking about the findings, but then if you come to that October webinar, Shirley is running that, and she'll be, she'll dig into what you see on that site, and she can answer these questions, really specifically in that webinar.
Yep, this is only the beginning. All right. We've got about 5 minutes left. And so I think I should ask this question, and I think might wrap things up well for us. From Rebecca, thanks for doing this. Who's the intended audience for these results? How might water managers, policymakers, and decision makers at different scales, for example, local, basin, state, or national, best use these results?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. For us, we have one audience is Congress, because they instructed us to do this. But beyond that, we think that the model results and the integration assessment results because they come out on a 12 scale, they can be used at a relatively smaller local and regional analysis. And we did some, or another team in the USGS did what they called a path analysis to look at who the primary users of this sort of information would be. And one use case is places where the background data, like the monitoring data, doesn't exist. And so by creating the wall-to-wall national output in this way, you give them something to work with as a start. You can also use this to look at your local area and place it in context of where it falls on the spectrum in the whole country. You can use it to understand how a region that's experiencing a certain problem, how broadly that problem is being experienced according to our assessments. And you can also find when because it's resolved at a monthly time scale, you can look at the trajectories over time of when these problem areas were kind of growing and shrinking as well. So, we think that there are a lot of use cases for this. We've also heard of a number of teachers who are using this material in classes. And it also serves as sort of a basis for the future work that the USGS is doing as well.
Thanks so much.
Julia, I dropped a link to that crop irrigation manuscript in the chat. I don't know if you saw that.
Yep, that is shared out now with everyone in the chat.
Oh, okay.
There's a few resources there in the chat. And then if folks also want to view some of the answered questions, there's some resources that have been shared in response to some of the questions as well. So take a moment to grab those links as we wrap up here. I think we have time for one last question. Okay, this is from Jeffrey Marshall. Was there any estimate of submarine discharge in the water balance?
So I assume it is submarine. So groundwater that's going to the coastal ocean. Good question. Probably not the way the models are constructed. I don't want to promise that was the case, but I don't think they would do that. I think I think they would route everything to a stream first before it went to the coastal ocean. So probably not.
Okie doke. Well, a huge thank you for everyone who joined. We had over 150 attendees today, so thank you for taking the time to join us. Again, this has been recorded and will be on the YouTube channel if you want to refer to it later. But a huge thank you to Edward and Megan for taking the time to present today. And have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.